Chapter 16. AJ hit the off button and looked at Jeff. "Looks like you're going to be a daddy a little sooner than you thought." Jeff's face was the color of paste when he looked at AJ. "Man, this is making those black diamonds look like the bunny slope." At least he wasn't passing out, AJ reasoned. "Tell me about it." He guided the car around 2 more turns, and then, just ahead, the boulders came into view. "Hang on, guys, we're almost there." Through the next 2 contractions, Eve worked to get things set up as the doctor had instructed. The last of the fresh towels from the other bathroom were stacked at the end of the bed. Pillows from every available source were on the floor waiting for Eve to get to the point that doable meets its time. Finally, she knew she could wait for them no longer. The gasp from the head of the bed jerked Eve's attention to it because this was no scream, but far more urgent. "Eve?" Lisa's astounded voice said as she clawed backward. "I think this is it." "Okay," Eve said, without so much as a moment of decision. "We're going to have to scoot you down to the end." Carefully, she worked Lisa's frame to the end of the bed even as she put the pillows behind her for support. At the end of the bed, she set first one foot, then the other on the 2 chairs she had swiped from the dining room. Her foot crunched over the shower curtain that was now lying on the floor beneath the end of the bed. "Do you know how to do this?" Lisa asked. "I was hoping you did," Eve said, with the slightest hint of a laugh under the statement. "Reminds me next time to keep AJ here with me. Maybe he would at least know what to do," Lisa said, obviously trying not to focus on the impending occasion. Eve couldn't have agreed more. "Okay," she said as she grabbed another towel and took up position at the end of the bed. "The doctor said on the next contraction, you take a deep breath, hold it, and push for 10 seconds. Then you rest. If the baby's head gets here, then you're going to have to pant instead of pushing." Concerned compliance crossed through Lisa's tired eyes. Some part of Eve wished there wasn't quite so much trust in those eyes, because if this ended badly, she knew who she would blame forever. "Don't think about that," she coached herself. "You can do this. You have to." A gasp, and Eve's inward coaching turned outward. "Here we go. Deep breath. Hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Had she been watching this on video, Eve was quite sure she would have passed out. However, there weren't enough brain signals left to shut her system down. 10. "Okay, stop." Head and shoulders, Lisa collapsed into the pillows. "I think skiing would have been more fun." "You think?" Eve asked as she pulled a fresh towel up from the stack on the floor. "Ready to try again?" "If I said no, would it make any difference?" Eve laughed without making much of a sound. "I doubt it." "Then I guess I'm ready." When the next contraction hit, they fell in line like a well-timed marching band, Eve coaching and Lisa pushing. "I see the head," Eve said as her breath stopped. "Pant, pant." Just as that contraction subsided, Eve heard the noise by the front door. However, she stayed with her job until in unison the 3 men burst through the door. Without any real discussion, they each took their place around the bed. "Lisa, baby, I'm so sorry," Jeff said, racing to take Lisa's hand and wrap her overwhelmed body as best he could in his arms. "I'm so glad you're here," Lisa said. Genuine tears traced down her cheek as she reached a hand up to clasp his. AJ helped Eve up from the floor, even as she gave the update to the doctor, who took her position. "I just saw the head," Eve said. "I've got towels and water." The doctor surveyed the situation and nodded to her. "I may have to sign you up for my nursing staff." A smile started on Eve's face just as the next contraction hit. Instantly, she and AJ sprang into action to assist the doctor. AJ grabbed the doctor's bag and started laying out the instruments that they would need. Eve stood, ready and willing to do whatever the doctor decided he needed her to do. 1, 2, 3. Eve started counting as though that was her assignment, the one thing she could still do after she had done so much. "We've got a crown," the doctor said excitedly. When Eve got to 10, Lisa relaxed, gulping in air as her shoulders went limp. "Eve," the doctor said, and she snapped to attention. "I want you and Jeff to hold Lisa up on this one. Make a back for her to lean on." Instantly, Eve stepped past AJ, whose countenance was pure concentration. She sat down on the bed as Jeff pulled Lisa up off the pillow. He sat behind her so that her shoulders rested on his, and Eve's place evaporated. Quickly, she grabbed Lisa's hand, and her excitement burst through her. "Hey, I saw the head. It's like right there." As she looked at her friend, it occurred to her that the one person who should be happiest at the moment was the one that was too exhausted to feel anything. Gently, Eve patted the hand she held. "You're about to be a mommy." Weakly, Lisa smiled at her as a contraction wrenched through her body. "Deep breath," Eve coached. "Push. 1, 2, 3. She was simultaneously watching Lisa and the doctor. "Don't stop," the doctor called as he worked with the baby. "Here's the head. Great, great. The head's out. Okay, Lisa, relax for a minute. You're doing so good." "Black hair," Eve told her, and Lisa's eyes went liquid. A moment, and then the doctor exhaled. "Here we go again. This is it." In the briefest span of time she had ever experienced, Eve's gaze caught AJ's, and he smiled at her in awe and excitement. Then their attention snapped back to the experience happening around them. 7, 8, 9, Eve counted as overwhelming wonderment gripped her. "It's here," the doctor said as his hands worked quickly. "And we have a baby boy." At that moment, a loud wail emanated from the tiny form in the doctor's hands. "And he has a good set of lungs, too." Relief flooded over Lisa, who collapsed into Jeff. Quickly, the doctor set about his work on the new life that had made such a grand entrance. "A boy," Jeff gasped as he hugged Lisa to him. "Oh, man, it's a boy." His face buckled into relief and joy. "We have a boy." The pent-up fear and determination spilled over Eve's lashes as relief flooded through her system. "You did it, Lise. You did it, girl." She squeezed the hand that was still in her own, and then looked over at the little bundle that the doctor laid into the clean towels AJ was holding. Carefully, AJ cleaned the child, and then he stopped and gazed down in complete wonder. "Oh, he's beautiful, Lise." AJ stepped over to the side of the bed with the baby cradled perfectly in his hands. As he passed the baby to Lisa, Eve got her first glimpse. Lots and lots of jet black hair. Once the transfer was made, AJ's hand found Eve's shoulder as the four of them gazed at the form that whimpered in Lisa's arms and then let out a loud cry. "Oh," Lisa said, resting into Jeff, who was smiling so big he looked like he might in fact burst. As Eve watched her friend, the tears slid into Lisa's eyes as she looked at the little creation in her arms. Gently, Lisa stroked the baby's cheek with the edge of her finger. "Hi, little one. How are you?" The baby let out another cry, and the four of them laughed. "He's so incredible," Jeff said, mesmerized by the sight. He pulled Lisa's head back into him and kissed the top of her hair. "Oh, man." His gaze went back to the tiny infant. Then he glanced up at AJ and seemed to remember the others in the room. The fringes of his lashes were laced with the emotion pouring from his heart. "Thanks, AJ, man." He reached over to shake AJ's hand. AJ shook Jeff's hand even as he said, "Hey, Eve's the one you should be thanking. All I did was drive." Gently, he laid his hands on her shoulders, and that simple gesture felt incredible. When Jeff looked at Eve, thanks was all but unnecessary. She reached over and put her hand on his forearm. "You've got one brave lady here," Eve said, as her hand slid from Jeff's arm to Lisa's. She did all the real work. However, Lisa was in a world unto herself as she gently stroked the tiny cheek. "Isn't he amazing?" Lisa asked in complete awe. "I have a baby. Oh my gosh." Emotion, relief, and overwhelming concern for her new role slid through her voice. She looked at Eve as if she couldn't quite figure out where she was. "I'm a mom. Then the tears took over. "And a beautiful one at that," Eve said as she leaned over and put her arms around Lisa. Head to head, they looked at the tiny figure whose eyes were blinking open. "Oh, man, we did it. I can't believe we did it." When the initial excitement waned and fatigue once again took over Lisa's features, AJ stepped away from the bed and set about cleaning the room. Luckily, Eve had done a good job of getting ready. He took the chairs back into the dining room and came back as the doctor took the baby to do a more thorough examination. Working quickly, AJ removed the shower curtain from the floor and stacked it with the 2 pans of water next to the bed. Room in that bathroom was at a premium, so he took the items to the other. He had just emptied the first pan into the tub when he felt Eve's presence behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, and his gaze caught hold of her standing in the doorway, hands in pockets, watching him. "Can I help?" "You sure?" She shrugged. "I made it through the delivery. Maybe I won't pass out now." "We need to get the sheets on the bed changed," he said, not letting his overwhelming desire to grab hold of her take him over. "Okay, I'll get that done." And she was gone. AJ couldn't quite find his breath back. He had thought she was the most incredible person he'd met long before now, but the second he had been given the chance to see her stand face to face with fear and pounded into submission, whatever denials about his feelings that he'd managed to muster to that point had disintegrated. She was strength personified, compassion, understanding, and beauty, all rolled into one. His heart turned over every time he thought about her voice on the phone, scared out of her mind and totally unsure of her own ability to handle the crisis. He laughed softly at the thought as he ran the water over the shower curtain. One thing was for sure. After today, if there was a crisis in his life, he wanted Eve right there beside him. "You want me to wash these?" she asked from behind him, and he jumped at the sound of her voice. "Yeah, we need to." She turned to leave. "And the towels, too," he called. Her form reappeared in the doorway. "I thought I told you I don't do blood." "Yeah, seems like I remember that part," he said with a laugh, and once again she was gone. Love, there was simply no other word for it, swept over him, and all other thoughts vanished. Somehow, he had to find a way to tell her, because sooner or later his body was going to get away from his mind, and at that point, there was no telling where this would go. Dr. Brealey had taken his instruments to the other bathroom, and Eve was busy wiping the master bath floor when AJ returned. She heard him in the bedroom, although he didn't know she was there. "Hey, Mom and Dad," he said, knocking softly, and Eve's heart jumped into her throat at the gentle sound of his voice. "How's the newest member of the family?" "Great, thanks to someone," Lisa said softly. She didn't have to see his eyes. Eve knew how serene they would look by heart. "Thanks for keeping Dad here in one piece," Lisa said as she reached up to put a hand on Jeff, who sat beside her on the bed. "Oh, so you didn't tell her about the black diamonds, then?" AJ asked with a laugh. "Shh," Jeff said instantly. "That was supposed to be a secret." "Some secret," Lisa said, and Eve heard the fatigue in her friend's voice. "If you wanted that one to fly, you should have taken Eve. Isn't that right, Eve?" Her heart snagged as she stood and stepped over to the door. "I certainly would have been safer." When Eve's gaze caught on AJ's smile, her heart did a somersault right through her chest. She pushed the hair up out of her face as she ducked back into the bathroom and threw the rag in the sink. Without question, she knew they could see straight through her when she looked at AJ, so she quickly decided it was best not to so much as glance in his direction when she walked back into the room. However, with his light gray sweater and happiness beaming from that sweet face, that wasn't exactly easy. "So," she said, focusing on the little family of 3 rather than on the figure standing on the other side of the bed. "What's this little miracle's name, anyway?" "Alexander Jeffrey," Lisa said lovingly. "Alexander," Eve repeated as she smiled and brushed a gentle hand over the baby's head. "That was Dustin's middle name." Lisa smiled at her. "It was my grandfather's, too." It's a beautiful name, Eve said as tears came to her eyes. Just like he is. Yeah, and I wonder where you got the Jeffrey part, AJ said teasingly. Must be the milkman's name or something. Hey, you better watch it over there. Jeff pointed a warning finger at AJ, but he laughed long before the statement had a chance to sound serious. Alexander Jeffrey, Eve said softly as she gazed at the tiny, scrunched-up face. Then the name jumped through her. AJ. What? He asked. No, she said, laughing. That's his initials, AJ. Oh, no, Jeff said in mock distress. He looked down at Lisa. Is it too late to change our minds? She didn't bother to even respond to the comment. Instead, she looked down at the little face and smiled. You hear that, Alex? You're named after 4 heroes. Undiluted joy slipped over AJ's features even as Eve tried not to watch him. Slowly, he shook his head as he took in the scene. After a moment, noise at the door brought the 4 gazes to it. I think we should let the new mama have some rest, Dr. Brealey said, clearly not wanting to break up the party. Yeah, AJ said softly. I think things are clean enough. We can do the rest later. Eve and AJ started for the door. Is it okay if I stay? Jeff asked, sounding unsure. Dr. Brealey smiled. They're all yours. They walked out into the living room, and AJ shut the door quietly behind them. Midway across the dining room, the doctor turned to him. Thanks so much, Doc, AJ said, suddenly feeling far older than he ever had before. We were lucky to have you. I think they are lucky to have such good friends as you two, Dr. Brealey said. AJ glanced at his watch. You want me to take you back down? Actually, the doctor said with a glance out the window that was now cloaked in falling darkness, I thought maybe I'd stay up here tonight, and tomorrow we could transport the 2 of them back down to the hospital. I'd really like the pediatrician to check the baby out. Okay, AJ said, working through that plan. You can have my room. I can take the couch. He could have my room, Eve said, stepping forward from where she was leaning on the back of the couch. Oh no, I'm not going to make a lady sleep on the couch, Dr. Brealey said. Even my dear wife, Charlotta, God rest her soul, sent me to the couch when someone was banished there. No, I couldn't take your room. It's settled then, AJ said. You know, we really probably need to think about something for supper, Eve said, sighing slowly. It's not hospital food, AJ said to Dr. Brealey, but she's not too bad of a cook. Eve shot him an I can't believe you just said that look. Well, if she cooks like she nurses, we're in good shape, Dr. Brealey said. Why don't you go get settled? Eve asked. I'll get something started. AJ waited for Dr. Brealey to turn back for the other bedrooms, and when Eve turned for the kitchen and brushed close to him, his sanity went with her. Scratching his head to beat the desire back down, he turned and followed them. Adrenaline. It was the only logical explanation of how Eve was still awake as she and the 3 men spent the meal getting to know one another. Dr. Brealey found AJ's stories of the big city trauma scene fascinating, and although a few of them threatened to make her sick, she too was enthralled. It wasn't the stories themselves, but how calmly he seemed to handle them, and how no matter how horrible they were, he seemed to have a way of thinking through a situation so the best thing could be done. From the little girl stuck in the drain pipe to the day that he and Jeff had met on a windy bridge, trying to pull a life back over the side, the stories solidified what she was beginning to see so clearly. There was far more to this soft-spoken, gentle soul than she had ever given him credit for. Well, it sounds like Houston's mighty lucky to have the 2 of you in its service, Dr. Brealey said with a note of approval in his voice. Machos a dime a dozen these days, but real courage is getting harder and harder to come by all the time. AJ shrugged as his gaze focused on his glass. I guess you do what you have to do. Yes, you do, Dr. Brealey said. Eve's gaze went to the downcast, thought-filled eyes she knew by heart. The heroism he exhibited wasn't about showing off to the world. It was based in a genuine desire to do whatever he could to help. right or wrong. Whether it turned out well or not, he was going to be right in there helping, doing whatever he could to make a difference. She had thought him so young, and yet it had nothing to do with being young. He had seen the horrors of the world, and he chose to live despite them. It was a standard she wished she had the courage to reach for. A moment of silence wrapped around the room, and then Jeff pushed back from the table. "I guess I'd better go check on them again. Make sure they haven't escaped or something." Instantly, Eve snapped back to reality as she, too, stood and grabbed for dishes. "Yeah, I'd better get this cleaned up." "Here," AJ said, stopping her hand with one touch as Jeff left. "I'll get these. You go relax." "I can get them," she said, not wanting him to think her weak. But his smile wafted through her tired soul. "I think you've done enough for today." "Oh, you think?" she asked as mischievousness slipped from his eyes to her heart. "Never argue with a man who's offering to do the dishes," Dr. Brealey said earnestly, and both gazes went to him. "That was the mantra my Charlotta lived by." "Well, Charlotta was a smart woman," AJ said, gazing right into Eve's eyes. Her spirit felt like it might float right off the earth as Eve released the dish in her hand to his care. "Well, I could use a shower." "There you go," Dr. Brealey said, standing. "Now, you go get comfortable. Us men can handle a few dishes." She stopped for one more moment as if to give them a chance to change their minds. "Go on," AJ said with a slight nod. "We'll still be here when you get back." "You promise?" she asked as fate turned a page right before her eyes. "You know it." When Eve came out of the bathroom, AJ took his turn. After a quick shower, he stood at the mirror. Without bothering too long with styling his hair, he ran some gel through it and called it good. He didn't even bother to grab a cap as he headed out to the living room. This wasn't about impressing her. It was simply about wanting to be with her every single moment that was available to him. However, when he stepped back out into the living room, only Dr. Brealey was there, sitting in the chair reading. "Shower's free," AJ said, not totally feeling in the same league with a good doctor. "Ah, okay," Dr. Brealey said, looking up at him. Then he returned to his reading. "Snow stopped. It's a nice night out." "Oh, really?" The old man's face lit with a soft smile. "I think you should go see for yourself." With a question, AJ looked over to the sliding door. He stepped over to it and pulled the curtain back. There on the porch, white sweater draped gracefully over a set of black jeans, stood the best dream he'd ever had. Slowly, quietly, he slid the door to the side, stepped out, and pulled the curtain and the door closed behind him. She was leaning on the railing with her elbows, gazing down past the pine trees into the hollow beyond. Peacefulness slipped into his spirit as he stepped to her side and laid his own elbows on the railing next to her. She never so much as glanced at him. "Dustin would have liked it here," she said, as if drifting on a dream. AJ's gaze floated over her, face, hair, gorgeous eyes. "You did good today." "He always said you couldn't judge somebody by what they say, but when they show you who they are, you should believe them." Her head dropped on the memory, and then, just as AJ thought he was going to lose her to the memories forever, she turned and caught his heart in her gaze. "I couldn't have gotten through today without you." Her eyes brightened with tears, and he saw every emotion, from fear to pain to joy, slide through her eyes. Gently, he turned to her, and she slipped into his arms, gripping him as though she was grabbing onto a lifeline. "I was so scared. And then the pickup, and they wouldn't come and help us, and I didn't know what I was going to do." His arms tightened around her, fighting off the nightmares of the afternoon that seemed to be clinging to her spirit. "Lisa kept looking at me like I knew what I was doing, but I didn't," she continued through the tears. "I didn't have a clue, and I just knew I was going to mess something up or do something that was going to hurt her or the baby." With a sniff, Eve wiped the tears as she pulled back from him. "But the whole time, I just kept thinking about you, and about how you didn't even question that I could handle it." She looked at him, searching through the depths of his eyes for his soul. Every time it got really bad, I could just hear you in my head saying, "You can do this, Eve. You can do this." And somehow I did. The honesty pouring from her heart became too much to allow her to face him, and she turned and gazed far out into the darkness. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of the wind in the trees amidst her sigh. When Dustin died, I didn't let anyone see the real me. I couldn't. They looked at me and they saw this rock. They thought I was handling everything so well. Somehow I knew I had to be strong, keep it together, so they wouldn't have to worry about me. What they didn't know was that I was really freaking out. There were days I couldn't even walk across the room without falling in the middle of the floor and laying there for hours. I couldn't go into our bedroom. I couldn't look at pictures. I couldn't even hear a siren without breaking down. I couldn't do anything. But the thing I really couldn't do was show that to anybody. I couldn't be who I really was with them. Her words faded out as he heard her soft breaths through the tears. Today, on the phone, with you, that's who I really was. I was scared and terrified and panicking. But you didn't think I was weak because of that. You made me believe I didn't have to not be weak to be strong. I could be scared out of my mind, but that was okay because I could be that and still do what needed to be done. Gently, he laid his hands on her shoulders, and after only a moment, she leaned back into him. His arms wrapped around her as they stared out into the night together. Her hair brushed across his cheek, causing emotions he'd never felt to surge to the surface. Just holding her this close made logic, reason, and reality slip away from him. You know, sometimes weakness isn't such a bad thing, he said softly. Sometimes it's in our weakest moment that we find out how strong we really are. She shook her head. I don't know how you do that every day. Going out there into situations you have no control over every day. It's like putting who you are in the middle of the highway, knowing you could get run over whether you make a wrong move or not. It happens. His mind flashed back to the sound of sirens and screams in the deep middle of a Houston night, and he took in a shaky breath. Sometimes you do get run over. But how do you do that? How do you get yourself to stand out there the next time? That was a question he had been asking ever since he had found out the fireman he had treated that night hadn't made it. Well, first you have to have a lot of faith. You have to believe that you did your best. And then sometimes it helps to have a really short memory. She shook her head incredulously. You laugh, she said, tilting again on the fear. But I just keep thinking if something would have happened today, I would never have forgiven myself. All laughter evaporated from his soul as his head fell. The air suddenly felt like a serrated edge to his burning lungs. I didn't say it was easy. A deep need to understand was lodged in her eyes when she turned to him, and her gaze burrowed into his. Were you scared today? Had he wanted to hide, there was no place to go, and the question hit him so fast that honesty was the only option. Like an avalanche that starts with one rock, but picks up frightening speed in mere seconds, the emotions he'd been holding down ever since the first time they didn't answer the phone cascaded over him. Terrified. His eyes fell closed as the stinging pain of helplessness flashed through him. I just kept thinking I should have known. I should have made it a point to call on every run. I could have driven faster, gotten up here sooner. I wanted to help Lisa. I wanted you not to sound so scared. I wanted to do something to help Jeff, because he looked like his world was crashing down around him, but there was nothing I could do to help any of you. A tear escaped from the edge of his eye and traced its way down his cheek like a single perfect raindrop. Then, like the brush of an angel's wing, She reached up and ran her thumb over it before tracing down his face to just past his lips. "So, white knights get scared too?" she asked softly, and when he opened his eyes, there was only a simple understanding in her eyes. "Yeah," he said, sniffing back the other tears. "They do." When her hand came to rest on his chest, the gap between his soul and hers disappeared, and as he gazed into her soft brown eyes, so did everything else. Softly, his hand slid up to the place where her sweater fell from her shoulder. At first, it did little more than brush the skin there, but in a rush, one touch was not enough. The palm of his hand slid under her hair and cupped around the slenderness of her neck. The trust in her eyes was the last thing he saw as his own fell closed. A brush, and only that, as the space between them evaporated in their need to be closer. Once, twice, his lips touched hers. Then need, want, and desire flashed through him in a blinding rush. He was no longer breathing, only living for his lips to be on hers. Deeper, he meshed his soul with hers, wanting only to go deeper still, until they were no longer two, but one and the same. Time and space skipped a beat as heart, body, and soul, he slipped through their bounds and flew with the angel in his arms. One hand slid down her back to the hollow at her waist as the other ran its way up and down the soft fabric covering her back, sensing the smooth silkiness of the skin beneath it. Ecstasy itself couldn't have felt as good. When his sanity corralled his body long enough to pull him back, he was still spinning on the passion flooding through him. In fact, he couldn't quite tell how his legs were still standing at this point. The last few moments in her arms made every death-defying stunt he'd ever pulled feel like sitting in a chair snoozing. Her gaze caught his, and he could see she was as blown away as he was. He tried to smile, but it didn't make it that far, as it vanished into the breathlessness clutching his body. Then the smile fell into a well of confusion and concern as he searched her eyes, trying to surmise if he had just made a huge mistake. However, there was no indictment in her eyes, only unconditional trust. "You shouldn't do that to me," he finally said, pulling sanity back to him with a gulp of the chilled night air. "Me?" she asked in surprise. "What did I do?" His smile returned. "Standing out here, looking all warm and inviting. You really shouldn't do that." "Yeah, I noticed you didn't bring a coat." "With you around, who needs one?" She slipped into the shelter of his embrace again. "You know, they're going to try to take the credit for this." Softly, he laughed as the middle of his soul opened up to the unqualified way she seemed to be with him. The barriers had collapsed. Friends had given way to something he had only allowed himself to hope for in the middle of his deepest dreams. "I'd say it's an even trade." And the tightening of her arms around him only solidified that belief. This has been White Knight, Book 2, The Courage Series, written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.
Never miss a second of the story. Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel today.